Welcome back to another concept video, and in this video I'm going to show you how to write better code and set up better projects. So let's get started. So we're starting off today's video by looking at an old project of mine called Pirate Attack. This was a randomly generated world where you had enemy ships that would spawn and you'd have to use your cannon to take them out and collect their treasure. It's on itch.io to play it. It's not my funnest game, I'm going to admit that now. But I thought it would be a really great example to show you of what a decent project looks like, but how we can make this a whole lot better. Step one, let's talk about folders. Now, on the side, we have all the different objects, and while this game's not huge, it still uses a lot of objects, and it's a really good idea to start breaking these down into folders. Now, a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is premium features, so if you're using the free version, obviously there's some stuff you will not be able to do, but I would encourage you, if you are taking Construct quite seriously, having these premium features does allow you to make some really great games. So right click, and we're going to add in a new subfolder. First one I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do tiles. So this game is made up by having a series of tiles. This includes stuff like grass and ground. So I'm going to wrap them into this folder here. We've also got stuff like the water tiles and the shore tiles. So I can take these as well, drag them up, and put them in my tiles folder. Then I can close this, hide it out of the way. We can also do stuff like the player can have their own dedicated folder. In a larger game, you might have the player that has multiple folders. There you go, I've missed one, beach, so let's move the beach in there. Now the player uses cannonballs. They also have their own ship. They have a progress bar to show when they can fire again. So I'm going to take all of these and place them in the player folder. I also want to have an enemy folder, and this contains all the information about my enemies. So this is the enemy ship, their cannonballs, and they drop chests, so I'm going to put the chests with the enemy. I'm going to create another folder as well for the UI, and I'm just going to take all the UI elements for now, and we could split this down further if we wanted to into subfolders, but I'm going to keep this fairly simple for now. So I'm just going to take anything to do with my UI and put it in the UI folder, close it off, and now I'm left with a couple of things. I've got the background and water background. So this is the background for the main menu, and the water background is the background you see here. So because the background is something that I'm going to see on the main menu, I could put it in the main menu folder. I'm just going to put the UI for now. The water background I will put with the tiles because it's kind of to do with terrain generation, as is advanced random. And then the start button, again, that's a main menu. I'll put that in the UI, and the keyboard I'm actually going to keep outside of the folders because it's an object that I use a lot. So straight away, when it comes to finding objects I want, if I want to place down an enemy ship, I can go to the enemies folder and grab that. If I want to look at my tiles, I can see all my tiles next to each other. So straight away, this has made my life so much easier. Step two, renaming your objects. Now, if we look at my tile objects, you can see the naming conventions are fine. They're okay. This is more than usable. But we're going to make some slight changes to make this even better. And the slight change we're going to make with these is the beginning word. I'm going to just add the word tile. Tile beach. Tile grass. Now, this looks like it's not really doing much. Yes, okay, it's now tile beach, tile grass, tile ground, tile shore. But what benefits does it give us? Well, the benefits are not actually on this side. Instead, if we go to our event sheet, I'm going to do a system action and create a new object. Our objects are in alphabetical order. So you can see as we go through, I've got ground there, I've got shore, but now I've got tile beach and tile grass together. And if I finish renaming all of my tiles, you can now see all my tiles are next to each other, and it makes it much easier to find it in the menu. This is also true when actually typing in object names. So now when I type in tile, I get all my tiles without me having to remember what they're all called. So for instance, I might type in the word sand, going, oh no, it's not called a sand tile, what did I call it? And then I would go through, checking my objects and go, oh, it's the beach tile. Now I can just type in tile and they all come up. Again, it's just making my life that little bit easier when searching through objects. Now you might be thinking, oh, that's all well and good. You've got objects that you could do this pattern for. But outside the tiles, what can we actually do? Well, the one that I use actually the most for is not tiles, because I don't always work with tiles, but actually text. By simply going to all of my text objects and starting it with the word text. Seems really silly in this side, but again, as you can see, when we're searching for an object, it's going to group all of our text objects together, and that's just really, really useful when working on large projects and we need to add an action where we need to create a text object, for instance, and we can just scroll down and all of our text is together. You can do the same for buttons. You can also do the same for anything linked to the player. So player gun, player sprites, player power up. So it links all the player stuff together. Obviously, if you're doing power ups, then give it power up and then the power up name would make more sense, but you get the idea. Next, let's talk about the object repository. Now, this is one of my bad habits that I'm not very good at getting out of this habit yet, but you can see that what I do with all my objects is I put them on the screen. Now, some contract objects will require you to put them on the screen and set their default properties. If you don't, then you have to set that up in the event sheet, and that costs you events. So it's always good to just put some objects on the screen with their default settings. The problem with this, it looks very messy, and if these objects affect the gameplay in any way, so for instance, I might want to say if there's no enemy pirate ships left in the game, spawn a new one. Well, this doesn't work if this guy's here. So what I need to do at the start of the game is either move him or delete him. If you've got something like a bullet, which I've had to happen before, the bullet actually fires and then it impacts the game because it could shoot the player or shoot an enemy because you've got this rogue bullet off the screen. So I'd have to take my bullet and make sure it's really far off the screen. So instead, you're interrupting my video. So instead we can move all these objects to something called the object repository. Now you go to this by creating a brand new layout. Make sure it's layout only and no event sheet, and then you give it the name object repository. Now I just copy and paste this in because I'm horrible at spelling, but what this allows you to do is take all of those objects that would just float off the screen, put them in your object repository, and that's it. They're all set up just here. Now the nice thing about this as well is you can actually then zoom down on this, and it doesn't matter how close you are because every time you go to the event sheet you'll be zoomed in the exact same way, which means these really tiny objects that I've got, and they need to be tiny because again I'm working on a very small tile based game, I can actually visualize much easier and see much better. I can organize these as well, so I can put my tiles next to each other, and this just gives me something that I can look back and forth to get an idea of what's going on in my game. So it's just a way to keep your objects organized. And again, for some construct objects, you're required to have the default properties set up. So for instance, these cannonballs, I've changed the speed and their gravity. Again, if I don't have these objects in the object repository or on the first layout, then these properties are not set up by default, which means I have to do them in the event sheet. So really, really useful to have this set up. And again, what it's done is now cleared it away from my layout. So these objects now do not affect this layout's rules. Let's talk about layers next. Now, I'm not going to talk too long about layers. I think layers are really, really easy to use. A couple of things, obviously just make sure you're naming your layers correctly. So for this one, I've called it layer 0. Actually, this would be better to be named game or game layer. I've got my HUDs. Just remember to lock your layers as well if you're not using them. Makes it really easy to not accidentally click stuff. Now, there's a couple of properties with layers you might not be aware of. So when you click on a layer, you can make it initially invisible. So even though you can have it visible on your side, you can make it invisible at the start of the game. Initially interactive is quite a new one that they added, and I say quite new, it's about a year old now, but essentially you can make it so you can't click on anything in that layer. So for instance, if you've got a pause menu, you don't want people to accidentally hit the buttons, so you can make it non-interactive, and then you could use an event sheet to trigger that. HTML element layer is again quite a new thing they've added. It just basically means you can render HTML objects as normal objects, which means you can have them appear below objects, which you couldn't do before. HTML layers were always created after everything else, which means they used to be on top of stuff even though you didn't want them to be. It's really annoying. And then a really powerful one that I didn't realize existed until making this video, that I might make a separate video about, I need to definitely play around with this more, is global. And essentially any other layer that shares the name, in this case game, will now use all of these properties. They'll share these properties. and by adding yes, we get the little globe icon next to our layers, and now they all follow the same rules. Really, really useful, really powerful. I'm glad we've got that feature in there. I'm going to set that to no for now. Now, with our layers, we can also create sub-layers. So for the HUD, you could have separate layers inside your HUD. What's really nice about using sub-layers is you can hide the HUD in one go, or you can hide certain elements in the HUD. And this works better for the game as well. So this game's not the best example because I haven't got too much to show. But if I throw back to an old Pokemon video of mine, if you remember that tutorial, then actually this would be really, really useful because actually everything was stacked on top of each other. This was done because it was a free tutorial, but also I was not as good at a construct program as I am now. This would be really great to hide each individual element so I can then work on other elements that are hidden below. While we're on the Pokemon layer, let's talk about the Z order bar. Now the Z order bar is one that's not enabled by default. It is actually a premium feature, which I don't agree with, but you get it by either going to Menu, View, Bars, and get the Z order bar, or you can click on any object, right click, go down to Z order, and open the Z order bar. Now what this does, it allows you to see which objects are on top of which objects. So you can see on the battle layer, I've got background 2, which is under all of these objects, and if I want, I can move it up, and again I can choose exactly whereabouts I want it to be, and I can put it all the way to the top if I wanted to. Now again, this is on the battle side, so we won't see it on the Pokemon UI side. So let's undo that, and let's take something else like, I don't know, this black border. And I can shift this to the top, and it's there. Again, this is a very small minor thing, but when you're dealing with very fiddly objects, this is something to always have open. What I normally find is this is closed most of the time when I'm working on construct. However, I go back when I'm working. However, when I need to work on getting stuff precisely positioned, where it's quite fiddly, that's where I'll then make use of this. And once I'm finished with it, I just close it. Moving back to our pirate ship example, the final thing we're going to do on this side before we jump into the event sheet is actually just looking at layout and event sheet names. Now, again, this one seems very obvious when you first think about it, but it's one that is easily missed. So going with layout 1, this is the game layout. Now, what I like to do when I rename it is I first like to write LO for layouts and then game. And if we go to the match and event sheet and we do the exact same, but this time write ES and then game. And I'll do the same with the layouts as well for the main menu. So LO for layout and then menu, and then same for event sheet 2, but this time putting ES. Now, again, this does not affect the game if you don't put this, but we're talking about writing better code. So when we go back to older project, it's easy to understand. And when we go to our top tabs, we can see LO, because that is the layout, and ES for the game. So now when we're going through this, and I've been really bad at this at times where I've been clicking on stuff and I go, nope, that's the event sheet, I want the layout. This makes your life so much easier because now you can just see the first 2 letters. I know that's an event sheet. Well, no, this is an event sheet. I know there's a layout. It just gets rid of that small confusion. And when we look at larger projects, so one of my recent game jams had 16 different layouts. It makes life so much easier when stuff is named properly. You can also create folders for your layouts if you weren't aware of this. Again, for this example, it is pointless, but if you had a larger game, you could have your levels be in one layout. You could have your different modes maybe in a different layout. So maybe if you've got a single player mode, a multiplayer mode, you could go to those menus first and then go to the levels. So again, it's all about just splitting up everything to make it a little bit more readable. As we jump into the event sheet then, let's start by talking about groups. Now, groups is the most useful thing when it comes to event sheets, and again, it's all about splitting up your code, making that a little bit more readable. So you create a group by right-clicking and adding a group. Groups have a name, a description, and you can actually make them active or unactive. So if you want a whole block of code that you want to disable, let's say you've got a game that is a platformer and halfway through you get to a level where you're now flying a plane, you might want to disable the whole platform group. You can do that in one go, which is really, really useful. I use groups more to just break down code. So for instance, we could talk about the random terrain gen and ignore that typo. I'm going to bring this all the way up to where that starts. So this starts Is it up here? And yeah, just start up here. Again, this is the benefit of having groups. I'm not having to guess where my code starts. I instead can just have all of it just here. So it all finishes here, so I'm holding shift to select all of that. And then I'm just going to drag this and put it underneath. And now everything to do with random terrain generation is now here. I can close that down. Now this next part is all about player and enemy combat. So I actually want to split this into two separate groups. So again, I'm going to add in a group, and you can add in subgroups as well. So you do this by clicking on the group, go to add, and add subgroups. You can also change the color of your groups if you want to as well. It's not something that I do very often, but it can be useful in certain situations. You might want to have maybe greener stuff that's finished, redder stuff you're currently working on. But let's add in a brand new group, and this time let's call it player. Now I've created both groups, but I've not moved anything yet because this comes to our next issue, unorganized code. As we write code, we're going to write stuff for the player first, then we'll write stuff for the enemies, then we might improve stuff for the player, then we might change stuff for the enemies. And what happens is we get a mix of player and enemy code all wrapped into one big block. So for instance, I can take these first bits of code here, and these are just to do with the player. But then I started working on the enemy code. So all of this is now enemy code. But then after I did that, I started working on cannonball logic. And I wanted to look at cannonballs that actually destroy when they hit different parts of the ground. And they're player cannonballs. And if the cannonballs hit the enemy ships, what happened? So then that needs to go into the players group. And then I realized the same logic needs to be applied to the player's cannonballs, also needs to be applied to the enemy's cannonballs. So when they hit different objects like the ground, the cannonballs need to destroy. And then if they hit the player needs to destroy. So then that needs adding. So that goes into the enemy group. But then I wanted to make it so the enemies drop ships, which is an idea I came up with. So then I created that for the player code. So now I need to take this code for the player. I just want the player to move slower if they were moving backwards, as is quite common with a boat. So again, all of this is now to do with player. And as you can see, it's really, really easy. And we're just talking about players and enemies. As you start introducing stuff like power-ups and game logic, everything just gets a bit mixed up. But by taking this time, and I always say for every 5 hours of creating your game, you should take at least an hour going back and improving what you've done previously. We've now got all the player logic all together. We've got the enemy logic together, and we're left with a couple of things. First of all, we've got some global variables, which is to do with randomly deciding how much gold is in a chest. So I'm going to move that up with the rest of global variables. I've got the global variable gold. We'll put that up there as well. And then I've got some basic game logic. So let's create one more. Let's create one more group for that. So game logic. And again, I'm just going to take both of these and put them into a group. Now if I want to work on the player, I can go to the player section and work on the player. And again, if we wanted to, we could add subgroups to this. So we could talk about player movement, player firing. I'm not going to go into that much depth in this video, but again, it is just as simple as right-clicking and adding in a subgroup. There we are. Subgroup, giving it a name, and then you could add that in. And again, that's just splitting up your code further. However, what I still find is when working on really large projects, even if you split stuff down to groups, you'll then have to sift through lots and lots of groups. It would be better if we could take some of these groups away and put them somewhere else until we need them. And that's where multiple event sheets come in. So what we're going to do is go to our event sheets, and we're going to add a brand new event sheet, ES, as we've talked about before, which is good naming convention, and player logic. Now, player logic is going to take all of this code here. So I'm literally going to do Control X to cut it, Control V to paste it. Now, if I play the game, nothing's going to happen. I can no longer shoot. I can move because it's done via behavior, but I can't shoot. None of my logic works, so the game is broken at this stage. Now, the reason the game's not working is our event sheet is attached to ES game, not player logic. And if we return to player logic, it means that the rest of our logic won't work, such as our enemies. Well, we're going to keep this as an ES game, And all we're going to do is right click and include event sheet. And we can include one for player logic. So now the event sheet player logic is included with this event sheet. However, it's just in a different event sheet. It's just out of the way. It's just a bit more hidden. And that means if I'm no longer working on the player's logic, I can just close that event sheet and I can go back to it and I can go, okay, I'm working on the player logic now. And why this does cause the issue of you're going to have a lot more tabs open at the top, so you need to actually remember to close tabs after a while. It does mean that when you're looking for certain events, it's now a case of going to the correct event sheet and looking for that object. So let me just do the same for the others and you can see how neat this looks once it's done. So this is what we're left with. We've just got the game logic here and the global variables. Just remember to go through and include all the event sheets you need. Now it's really easy to accidentally add an event you don't need, so just double check you're adding the correct ones. So I want the train logic, but I don't want the main menu logic in there. And now all our code is split up into 3 other event sheets for the player, the enemy, and the terrain. And again, for a project this size, maybe not needed, but for a larger project, definitely needed. And if you are working on a small project that you plan to expand, start this stuff early. It means you don't have to do it later on. I've also just gone into my folder and just created a folder called Game Logic, which just has these 3 event sheets in there, which means I can hide this and just have my 2 main ones being the game and the menu. And then I could break these down further if I wanted to see the enemy, player, and terrain logic. So moving on, let's talk about global variables. Now, global variables is a pet peeve of mine when it comes to construct, because when you go to add an action, if I go to this one, for instance, let's subtract one from timer, all of my variables come up in a big list. Now they are in alphabetical order, which gives us some use. However, if you're creating a large project and you've got 50 global variables, you now need to sort through 50 global variables. This becomes a huge pain. So what stuff can we do to make this better? So step 1, you can move these into different event sheets. Now you can't just cut them like you will normally, because what happens is if you delete the variable, even though we're just moving it, it will delete any code attached to that variable. So this will break your project. So instead we're going to cancel that and we're going to right click and we're going to move to an event sheet. So this is actually to do with terrain logic. So the first thing I want to do, it's not going to fix my problem that I just talked about, but it is going to reduce what global variables I see on this event sheet. So if you've got lots of them, you might want to split them up into the different event sheets where they matter. Now going back to the one that I just moved, this island gap only affects any code to do with random terrain generation. So if I was to move it to be a local variable, it still works. Now you have to be really careful with this, because if you change something from a global variable to a local variable and affects other code, it will delete that other code. Now, unfortunately, Construct does not warn you of this. I prefer if Construct gave you a warning going, well, this will delete other code. Again, that means we can go, well, actually, I don't want to make that change. For now, you need to have a good understanding of your own code before you make these changes. So make these changes sparingly, just where you know you can get away with it. And again, that'll just get rid of a few global variables. So I also know we can get rid of the layout created. I'm going to keep it there for now. Now we can also rename these, and again going for names that are close to each other alphabetically might be beneficial, but this can only take us so far. And for global variables, I prefer to have short, simple names like gold, like timer. So what else can we do about these pesky global variables? Well, where possible, we can attach them to objects. So for instance, cooldown is what is the cannon cooldown before you can fire again. Instead of having this attached to our global variable, I can attach this to my player. So I'm going to go to the player logic, go to my ship, and I can add an instance variable. I could also add the timer behavior, which in hindsight would have been better. To just show you about changing variables, I'm going to create it as a variable. So I'm going to write cooldown, make it a number, set to 100. I then look for that code in my player's logic. And you can see system set cooldown 100. And all I need to do is take the time to just change it to a player logic instead. You can see those folders just making it much easier for me to find the objects I want. So instead of setting the cooldown to 100 as a global variable, I'm just going to set it as a ship variable. I then got the logic here to say is cooldown equal to 0. So again, I'm going to do the same using my ship. And why this just took about 5 minutes out of my time when I could be working on other stuff is now meant I can actually take the global variable of cooldown and delete it. Now it's still used elsewhere. I thought I did get rid of all of them, but this gives me a chance to look at the find all references. So this allows me to see where else it's referenced, and it is referenced here. So I can double click on it and I can see there's one more instance where I set this back to 100 that I've just missed. So I can copy and paste it and then delete it. And now you can see it's only attached on the global variable. So now I can go back to my global variable and delete it. So why I do think that this is the hardest part about fixing your code, it definitely does make a difference. Attaching stuff to objects is better where you can get away with it, but global variables are a necessary evil. In other languages, they are far better, but with Construct, because we've got that big drop-down list, they do just get annoying. So fix what you can with this part. Next, let's talk about reducing code. Now, people think that if your project's got lots and lots of code, it's a great project. It just means you've been working on it longer. But actually, better project is where you're able to reduce code and work smarter. So I've got this really simple example here that's in my code where I'm checking if the cannonball is overlapping the tile ground or the tile beach, we're going to destroy the cannonball. If you've got code that has the exact same action behind it, then you can combine your conditions together. So what I'm going to do to do this is just take both of these and place them together like so. Delete the line of code below and then just right click and make an OR block. Now we're saying if the cannonball is touching the tile ground or tile beach, destroy the cannonball. Now this one's a very minor example up here, but the idea of using functions as well is really, really useful. Now I wouldn't use a function normally for this, but just to show what functions are used for and how it could be useful, is we've got this code here. Now we've got, it spawns a cannonball, it shoots it with plus 90 degrees, set cooldown to 100. You can see if we look at the other side, when we press the Z key, we spawn a cannonball, we set the angle to minus 90 degrees, we set the cooldown to 100. They're doing the exact same thing with just a plus and minus changing. So functions are really, really useful to reduce blocks of code where it's not quite possible to get away with OR statements. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to give it the name of shoots cannon. And then I'm going to take the code that's repeated and put it in this logic here. I'm also going to bring this up to the top just so it's a bit easier to see for the video. And then I can actually take out those repeated bits of code on the other side as well, and instead just use the function of shoot cannon. And all this means is if I need to change any code related to shooting the cannon, I can change it at the top instead of changing it in two places. And I can even take this further and actually apply the set angle to the ship. So I'm going to bring this in as well. Now I'm going to add in a parameter for this. Now parameter just means if you want to use this function, you need to supply an argument of some sort. And the argument is going to be the cannon angle. Now I'm not going to write I'm not just going to write angle because it's a keyword, so it won't let me use it. So I'm going to write cannon angle. And the default value is going to be set to 90, for instance. So now what happens is when I shoot the cannon, I can get rid of that as well. I'm going to shoot an angle of 90. And when I shoot this cannon, I'm going to shoot at minus 90. And again, really minor change for this one. It's not going to make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. But if you had a function that did a lot more, then this is really, really useful. And making use of parameters especially means that now you've got a multi-purpose function. We can then add in another key that allows us to shoot in other direction, and we can all use the same function. We can even take this further by taking the fact that we're always only shooting if the cooldown equals 0, and just apply that as a condition. And again, all I've done now is just massively reduced a block of code down to a function, and then when these keys fire, they fire that function. So next thing I want to talk about is comments and event ordering. And this is something you're more likely to do when you go back through your code and make improvements. And again, making improvements on your code is not the most fun thing you can do, but it is really rewarding. You'll get a lot more out of the next part of your code when the first bit's more organized. So we've got all this code here, and why it's all grouped into this player section, it doesn't mean it's the easiest to read still. So think about what stuff makes sense to have first. So first thing I've got is about movement. I think movement's really important. So I'm going to actually make this the first thing that happens. I then want to have all my cannon logic together. So I shoot a cannon by pressing X or Y. So I can have the function first or the function last. That doesn't really matter. I've got my cooldown codes to make that happen. I've then got the creation of my cannon and the destruction of my cannon. Hits the enemy ship, then it overlaps the chest. That makes sense now. We can also add in comments. So I can talk about player movement. And these kind of work the same as groups. They're not as good as groups, to be honest, but you can talk about them a lot more, so you can have more detail in there. They also don't take an event. So groups actually take an event. I don't agree with this. I think it's just the way it's been programmed. So if you're on the free version and you've got limited events, you might be put off by groups. So you might prefer to use comments instead. But again, just using these comments to break up stuff. So we can now put cannon fire. And the nice thing with comments, I guess, is they are not as evasive as groups. So for smaller breakups of codes, it's a bit nicer actually. And then we can talk about hitting enemies. And again, it is just a small thing, but just having your similar events next to each other does help quite a lot. Now our objects are organized, now our events are organized. How do we fix bigger problems? Problems that are causing issues in our code and we're not quite sure where those issues are coming from. Well, this is where it's quite a nice idea to create a range of tools to help us out. So one of the tools you might want to include, and I actually quite like doing this as its own event sheet, is just debug tools. So you actually spend time programming something into the game that you're never actually going to have in the final version. And just to show you a really simple example of this, all I'm going to do is do on key pressed P, and I'm going to set the time scale to 0. And I want to reverse this, so I'm just going to quickly copy and paste this. And just to be lazy, you can obviously add a variable to flip between these. I'm just going to set O, and that will set the timescale back to 1. As always, when we're using these tools, we just need to make sure that it is included. So include debug tools. And again, this gives me a way to pause the game. Now, you might be asking, why would I want to pause the game? Well, if I come to the top here and click on this drop-down arrow, we get this option called debug layout. Now, debug layout and debug project are extremely useful, and they're going to help us try and find some issues with our code really, really easily. You can also, as of one of the latest features, set your main button to be the debug layout or debug project, and it just means that you're not having to use this drop-down menu every single time. So my game's loaded up. I've automatically paused it by using my P key, and I can also pause it just using the option here. However, I like having it mapped to a key because sometimes if you're playing quite a fast-paced game, you might want to pause it as you're playing midway through the game, and having to then move your mouse to this position and click takes a lot less time than I've got my hands on W, A, and D, I've got a free hand, I tap P. It's just much easier. And this screen can look really confusing, really daunting, but we're caring about a few main things. First of all, frame rate is quite an interesting property. These random generated maps are awful for frame rates, and that's mainly because I'm generating a huge map and I'm not doing anything like chunks. Again, that's not really mattering to this project, but it's a good idea to look at frame rate and go, well, why is this so low? What can I do to optimize this and make this better? But the main things we want to look at is variables and positions. So we've got our global variables here, so we can see the enemy ships, the gold, layout created, random number, and timer. If you have an issue where a global variable is not triggering properly, you might want to see what the value is at any given time. We can also go to any particular objects, such as enemy ships, And I might want to say, well, actually, how good is the spawning of enemy ships? Whereabouts are they spawning on the screen? And by clicking on them, we can highlight it. So this is the first one that was created. It was created in this position. We can see its exact X and Y coordinates. We can see its current speeds using the car behavior. We can see its pathfinding, so it has a path. It is moving on that path. And if it was to have any local variables attached to it, which we'll look at when we look at the player's ship, we could see those as well. And we can do the same by looking on any other ship on the map and see where they are. So if we can see player number 3 is actually not on the screen, and he's currently at the position of 1651. So he is quite far across the screen to everybody else. And it might be a case of, well, I only want to spawn in the area of 1,000 pixels from the player, so this is too far. So that's something I can look at and fix. Going to the player's boat then, we can see that the cooldown is set to 0 because he's not fired. I'm going to unpause the game, and then I'm just going to fire a single shot and pause it again. Now, annoyingly, is when I'm pressing P, it's not actually pausing the cooldown. So the cooldown still works in the game to pause. And again, that's something you might want to look at when doing pause menus. Something I didn't know until now, but because I've got the debug menu, I'm able to spot these issues that I wouldn't be able to spot normally. So this is something you definitely want to have open. You definitely want to look at quite often, because you'll find some really interesting stuff coming from here, like the fact that I've got 26,000 objects on the screen. No wonder that I've only got 57 FPS. Then you can start finding ways to tackle these problems from there. You can also destroy objects in the game. Again, this could be useful in certain situations. Let's say that you had to collect 5 items to open a door to get to the next level, and you just want to test the next level. You could destroy the door. That way you can go straight to the next level without having to collect the 5 things, because again, you're only testing the game. Finally, on this topic of sort of debugging, the thing that I do the most when it comes to debugging is actually create a text box called debug. Now you can call it debug or text debug, as we've talked about for good naming conventions. This one I don't mind too much just calling it debug, because it's something that I use a lot and go back to a lot, and it's again a separate text object because it's not going to be in the final game. But all I do is I place this. Now this is going to be on my HUD layer, which it kind of is on layer 0. Let's put it on the HUD properly. And all I literally do is just have this on the screen, and at any point where I've got an issue not working, I can go in. Let's go back to my player logic. And for instance, I've got the cooldown. So every tick of cooldown is not 0. I can actually go to my debug text and I can set it to a certain value. So this is really good for looking at one particular variable and seeing what that one's doing. So this one could be ship.cooldown. So a couple of final things, and I want to talk about the most advanced things last that you can do. And this is about making use of arrays first of all. This seems to be something that I talk about in every single episode, which I'm sorry, it's just a really powerful, useful tool that you use everywhere. But let's look at the terrain generation. The way this works is it uses the advanced random and it takes in some values. Now you will see an example coming on the main channel soon, because I plan to remake my 2D Minecraft tutorial, and hopefully now with infinite terrain generation and caves. Again, that's a challenge I'll be working on this week to get that one working. But it has the same logic of using this if advanced random is less than a certain number. And by tweaking these values, we can get more grass, more beach, more shores, more water. I'm not going to go into too much detail because this is not a random terrain generation video. But these values here, I tend to tweak them quite often when working on random terrain generation. And if you're working on something larger, such as 2D Minecraft, you can have a lot more of these, because now we want to add in factors such as the different ores, we want gravel, andesite, diorite, how often caves appear. So I'm going to have a lot of these values, and I can go through this code and just change these values. However, it would be more useful if this was in one place. Now I could have them as global variables, but as you know, I hate global variables because they get cluttered and there's too many of them. So where possible, I want to reduce how many global variables I'm using. So the other option is to actually create a new file, create an array, and we can store everything as an array. Now when you're doing this, I also recommend just undock, so you can have this separately. And let's go back to my terrain logic. And I have got 4 different values that I'm storing. So I'm just going to set the width to 4. And the first one is deciding how much grass I've got. So I'm just going to rename this to grass. You can also do this as 0 grass, is actually a new habit I'm trying to get into, because that way you keep the index value intact, and the index value is really useful to finding out which column you need to call back to when you're doing the event sheet. My second one that I've got is the beach, so I'm going to do the same for beach. And let me just speed this bit of the video up ahead. And then I'm just going to put in the values that I've decided already. So 0.37, 0.41, 0.42, and 0.47. And again, these are variables that I might want to tweak and change often. So having them as variables instead of buried in my code just makes my life much easier. At any point I can come to this window here and change my terrain. And again, in this example, not a huge issue. When we talk something about Minecraft, where actually changing the terrain of the world can be really impactful and really important to our structure, then yes, this is definitely more useful. Now, obviously to get this out, we need to do some basic logic, and again we can do this in a separate event sheet if we want to. I'm going to put in my game logic because it's kind of to do with games. I also need to add the Ajax option and also an array, so I'm just going to add both of those. And this is kind of the thing that annoys me a little bit. The error you'd want to see partway through recording. Hopefully it's going to be fine. I'm just going to crop the screen so you don't see that. And after I've added the array, I also need to add Ajax. And again, this is a little bit of annoying. I'd rather that we didn't have to go through this much steps to import a file. I get why we have to, just a slight annoyance. But if you've never seen me do this before, what you can do is you can do an on start of layout. So when the layout starts, we can use Ajax to fetch that project file. So again, just make sure you get the right one, because you've also got in the icons. So you can change the icon of your project as well, which we sort of covered when we did the mobile app. And then we can say Ajax on complete, and then add action, and then array dot load Ajax last data. I've done this quite a few times, but going back to my train logic, I can then go on to each of the values, and instead of doing 0.37, island gap is just a variable that just decides how many islands there are. So if that variable is smaller, you actually get less islands appear. If that variable is bigger, you get more islands appear. I'll leave this project linked as well if you want to check this out. I did do a video on it, but didn't have all the pirate logic in, so you can see that as well. But all I'm going to do now is take my array, and again, naming the array would be better. We've talked about naming conventions, and I'm calling stuff array still, but array dot at, and then it's that number that we had. So for this first one, it would be 0. And what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this to make my life easier, and then just do the same for the others. So a very minor change again. Let's change that to 1. But this minor change again just speeds up how quickly it is to change something as simple as the terrain values, which in this case is really useful. But you could use this as well for having player stats if they're non-standard stats like you'd find in the behaviors. If it was to do with enemy stats or enemy spawning, anything where you've got quite a few variables that you want to change, but you want to keep away from your global variables. And if you are using a little bit of code quite often, say like this bit of code, and you don't want to set up something like that, you can also, if we click on this side one, you can create something called a bookmark. So we can do toggle bookmark, and then you can actually add in a new option, a new bar called the bookmark bar. Now I recommend the bookmark bar you put underneath something like your properties bar, or if you're not using your layers very often, it could go here. I'll put it under my properties bar for now. And when we click on this, it'll take us to that section. So I'm working on some other code, I'm working here and go, I need to change the terrain again. I can double click and go straight to that bit of code. So that's another option as well to make navigation much easier. And finally, I just want to talk quickly about families. I think I'm going to make a mini Patreon episode about families later down the line, so I'll probably combine that with another video so you get 2 videos that month. But families are really, really useful. And the idea behind families is you can have objects that are completely different to each other. So in this example that is from the construct page, we've got the blade enemy, the bug enemy, the crescent enemy, and the fighter enemy. We want these to have their own particular code behind them, their own particular behaviors, but we also want to share code and share behaviors. So what we can do is we can go down to families and add a new family. In that family, we can edit it and we can add in all our different types of enemies. You can see there's quite a few different enemies beyond the ones we just talked about. And then going into the family behaviors, we can give them all shared behaviors. In this case, we haven't done that, but we could all give them the solid behavior. So I sometimes use this for different platform types, especially in 3D games. We can also give them shared instance variables. So for instance, they might all have health. So we could all give them a health variable instead of doing health to each individual one. And the big impact comes when we go to the event sheet. So what we've got is what we'd have to do normally if we did not have families. So on laser, on collision with blade enemy, destroy the blade enemy, destroy the laser. Hit the bug enemy, destroy the bug enemy, destroy the laser. By adding them to a family, whether we only use the family for this one block of code, we can now say if the laser collides with anybody in that family, any enemy, destroy that particular enemy, destroy the laser. So the difference in code is absolutely huge. And this is one of the big things I want to get across. Shorter code is better code. If you can find a way to do the exact same thing with less code, that is better. Whether that's through functions, through families, or using just some basic OR statements, you're going to have better code. But that is it for today's video. Hopefully you found this Patreon episode quite interesting, quite useful. I've been writing construct code for about 2 or 3 years now, and the difference of my code writing from where it is now to where it was before is absolutely huge. And you can just see that from my Pokemon tutorial video. Sorry if anybody followed that because it's actually awful code. Now I look at it, even just stuff like creating arrays is a pain. Now, I did have to do it this way because you can't actually do Ajax and file types on the free version. Again, I get that some stuff needs to be locked behind a paywall. That one I don't agree with. I think that would be better to have for everybody to use. But again, there's lots of repeats in there. And while I was doing stuff really good like comments and functions, there are definitely things I could have done better. So let me know which thing you've learned that you weren't sure of before, what you're going to apply to your own code, and I'll see you in the next video.